Welcome to Pretty Lies and Alibis. Let's seek the truth and travel the long road to justice together. What you know, Alibiers, welcome to another episode of Pretty Lies and Alibis. I'm Gigi. Good to have you here. It is Monday, huge day so far in the chaddaybell trial. We're going to jump in, but first, if you're watching on YouTube, you know the drill. Don't forget to hit subscribe if you haven't already. Like the video, share it with your friends, and you can ring my bell if you want notifications of when I post new content. Just be sure to click on that bell icon. Music fact of the day. Billy Joel wrote, "We didn't start the fire," after hearing it was easier growing up in the 50s than in the 80s. He started with the year of his birth and went to the current time of 1989 when he wrote the song. Y'all, Melaniece took the stand today. Totally took everybody by surprise. We're going to get into her testimony. First, we're going to finish up with FBI Special Agent Daniel's testimony. We left off on Friday talking about Tylee's burial site and how they found it, excavated it, and found her remains. Today, we pick up with the discovery of JJ's burial site. Now, I have to say, Chad watched the screen pretty much the whole time from what I could see. The very last thing they talked about on Friday was actually searching the barn and the tools in Chad's shed. They show an overhead photo of the tree in the pond area where JJ was found. And then they show that view from Chad's upstairs window as well. He said as they walked towards the area where JJ was found, they saw some taller grass, and then they started to see a difference in the vegetation as they got closer. The area has a raised berm, which has thinner vegetation compared to the rest of the grass, and then also some bare spots. They show another photo, which is a close-up of the burial site where JJ was found before they broke ground there. There's a photo with the blue tint up. Once they find the area, like with Tylee's, they go layer by layer to make sure they're not missing any evidence. Trigger warning, if you're sensitive to this kind of stuff, you might want to click off here. As they go down, they see stones and cement blocks. The stones had these wooden planks underneath, and around the stones, you see the tree roots have been cut very precisely. The next photo shows the black plastic bag visible in the picture, and the soil gets darker as they get closer to JJ's remains. The witness took his hands and scraped around the plastic to remove dirt. It felt like a human head inside the plastic, and the bags were very tightly wrapped on the body. He took a razor blade and made a cut in the plastic bag, and that revealed another white plastic bag underneath. Once they cut through that white plastic bag, hair was visible, and they knew they had human remains at that point. They continue excavating, and then the plastic bag that JJ's body was wrapped in was just more visible. They also show a photo which you can see the duct tape on top of the plastic bags covering his body. By the way, these photos were not shown to the public. I'm going through some of my notes from last year where we got to see these photos. The next photo shows the full excavation, and more duct tape is visible, and it really gives a good visual of how his body was wrapped. At this point, the team is ready to remove his remains. JJ's remains were actually the first remains they found. They show a photo of the decomposition that was on the ground after his remains were moved. They also show a photo of the wooden planks and those stones by themselves on a tarp. After they excavated JJ's burial site, they still didn't know where Tylee was located, so they brought the backhoe in to go deeper and wider just to see if perhaps the two had been buried in the same spot. They show faro scans of the progression of excavating that grave. Layer A and B are the rocks in the wood. JJ's remains were found at a depth of only around 2 feet. The remains became visible once they were 1 foot down. On cross, this was a big old mess. I don't know what Pryor was trying to get at here. This witness was involved in the search of 2 of the townhomes, and they did use a cadaver dog from an outside agency. Pryor asked if they used luminol to highlight to show the presence of blood in an upstairs closet. The witness does not remember and does not have his notes. Then Pryor asked if it's usual to review his notes regarding the search warrant at the townhomes. And the witness says he came to testify about the search warrant on Chad's property. He did not know he would be talking about the search warrant at the townhomes. They bring up that second floor view. The witness has been in the house. And Pryor asked if the so-called second floor is an attached garage. Yes. Then Pryor points out you have to leave the main residence to get to that attached structure, and the witness says yes. Pryor asked if he knew what the room was used for, and the witness said that day there was a mattress and a comforter that looked like somebody had been sleeping in it was up there. He doesn't know who resided at the residence in June of 2020. Pryor asked how many people secured the Daybell home, and then he talks about a meeting they had before executing the search warrant. The witness doesn't know how many people were there. He asked who from the prosecutor's office was at that meeting, and Pryor specifically asked if Rob Wood was there. The witness said the briefing was the night before, and that was not at the church where they staged. There were over 10 people there, but he just doesn't know how many. And he doesn't really answer about Rob Wood being there. He asked how many people were at the property. The witness says there were probably just over 50 people at that property over the course of the 2 days they searched. Pryor says he took the liberty of reviewing the witness's logs, and you're aware Mr. Wood was there when the remains were uncovered. The witness says he saw Rob Wood on the scene, but he didn't know who he was. Pryor asked if Rob Wood introduced himself the night before the search warrant, and he said no. Pryor says you didn't take the initiative to introduce yourself to the lead prosecutor, and the witness says, I was busy. Pryor asked the distance of how far JJ's grave was from the back of the house, and the witness doesn't know. Defense asked if the grass was high around where JJ was located, and the witness said fairly high. He asked if that's a pasture, and the witness says, I wouldn't say yes or no to that. But Pryor asked if there was a large tree and an irrigation pond near where JJ's remains were found, and he says yes. He asked the witness, does it look like it's been mowed? And the witness says, I don't know if you mow that grass or what you do to it, but it did not look like it had been mowed recently. The defense says the theory from the state is the bodies were placed in the ground in September, and the witness says, I don't know what the state's theory is. The defense says, you found the charm and the necklace, and then you showed a photo of Tylee wearing the necklace. He said, let's assume the bodies were placed in September. When did you retrieve that pendant, and when did the photo get taken? They took it on June 9th. Pryor asked if the charm was on top of the ground, and the witness says it was visible on top of the ground. The defense asked if it looked like somebody tried to conceal it, and the witness says it was on top of the ground. The defense, you had access to a backhoe to be sure you got all the potential skeletal remains. You removed dirt from Tylee's burial site. The witness says they excavated around the burial site before they actually located her remains. He's asked if he's certain they removed all the remains from Tylee's gravesite. He says yes. Pryor asks if they got all of JJ's remains. He says yes. When asked what they did to secure the property overnight, the witness says that was controlled by local authorities. Pryor shows a photo of the tools. He goes on and on about this. He asks if there is something unique about the handle on the shovel. The witness says that the tools were laid out and photographed, and he can't tell from this photo if there's anything that stands out. The witness did not lay the tools out himself. Again, Pryor asks what the witness sees on the black handle of the shovel, and the witness says it's hard to tell what you're saying it is. Pryor says it's something, right? And the witness says, I don't know what it is. The defense says it's a different look than when it was standing up in the garage, and the witness just has no clue what Pryor's talking about. So he shows another close-up of the shovel handle and says, I'm asking about the difference from this and the one on the ground. The witness says, I'm not seeing what you're trying to get me to see. The witness says, I see a black shovel handle, and Pryor says, fair enough. He publishes a photo of the tools upright and says at some point they were put back against the wall and a subsequent picture was taken. He asked the witness if he saw anything unusual about the handle of the shovel, and the witness says no. Pryor says, okay. He zooms in and asks the witness, does that help? Witness, no. Pryor says, okay. Then he says at some point photos were taken of the shovels against the wall. The witness says the first photo was the as-is photo, how they were found against the wall. Then Pryor brings up the photos of the tools on the floor. Someone took them and put them on the floor and then back against the wall. The witness says, I don't know who did that or what time it happened. Then Pryor asked if anyone used the Daybell shovel or pickaxe to excavate the graves. The witness sounded a little insulted by this and said no. He's asked if anybody had access to the garage once law enforcement arrived other than law enforcement on the 9th and the 10th, the dates of the search warrants, and the witness says no. He's asked if the shovels were secured by law enforcement. The witness says yes. Pryor asked about JJ's burial site, if it was 1.5 feet deep, and the witness said just over 2 feet. He's asked if he knows the length and the width of the grave, and the man said he would need to see the Faro scanner information. The defense says you found JJ's grave from electronic data. And the witness explains they used ping information from Alex's account to show someone was in the area, but he reminds the defense, we showed you a photo where it was easy for law enforcement who's used to looking for this stuff to identify where the burial site was. At this point, Pryor just says he's going to object, and then Judge Boyce gets very stern and tells Pryor to stop talking over the witness, and they go back and forth. And then Judge Boyce says, "You just interrupted me." He tells Pryor to ask another question, and the witness says the ping was the first thing they used. He talks about they used the word pet cemetery. Did you locate a makeshift sign on the Daybell property? And the witness says there were 2 wooden posts, and in front of the post, there was the dog statue. He asked if the dog statue helped them locate the pet cemetery, and the witness says the dog statue and also in front of them were depressions in the earth, which is an indicator of a burial site. So he made a square around that and deemed it the pet cemetery. On redirect, prosecutor Rob Wood talks about securing the scene overnight from the 9th to the 10th. He asked if the property was in the same condition that next morning. Yes. They gave the tools to the Rexburg PD after packaging them up. Rob Wood says, "You were told I was there, but do you remember if Fremont County prosecutors were there as well?" The witness doesn't know. They did find dog and cat remains in the pet cemetery, no raccoon. Interestingly enough, if you remember Chad's statement to Tammy Daybell in that text. Next up, Melaniece. It happened, y'all. She came in. I was shocked. She goes through. Lori is her aunt. Alex is her uncle. She knows Chad, saying that he married her Aunt Lori in November 2019. Melaniece said she was close to Lori and Alex. She looked to Lori as a mother figure, and she personally met Chad in November 2018. A lot of the information she got would be Lori would tell her, "Chad said to tell you this." Most of that information came through Lori, and Melaniece would send messages to Chad through Lori asking for advice or guidance. She said she became close to Chad and referred to him as dad. Both Chad and Lori shared their beliefs with her about light and dark. Sometimes they were together when they did this, sometimes they were separate. She doesn't remember ever talking to Chad alone about these beliefs. She just remembers together, and then she did talk to Lori alone about this stuff. But the idea of light and dark came from Chad. Lori and Chad told her Chad was said to have a gift to see if a person was light or dark or if they had good or bad intentions. He would use a pendulum to get answers to things he wanted to know. She makes a swinging motion with her hand, but he didn't always need that. They taught Melaniece about the castings, and they would tell you to raise your right hand to cast out a demon or dark spirit. Castings would be done at any time for anyone if you felt you're being inflicted with a dark spirit or a bad feeling or somebody else. She did participate in castings for Charles. She learned JJ and Tylee were labeled as dark, and she assumed it was Chad who deemed them dark. Lori and Chad were at the castings for Charles, and she's asked where the idea of casting originated, and she said their teachings and ideas were constantly changing, meaning Lori and Chad's, but originally it came from a Julie Rowe podcast. She had a long way of doing the castings, and Chad and Lori just added their own ideas to Julie Rowe's. She last saw Tylee alive when they were packing up in Arizona to make that move to Rexburg, Idaho. About being told Charles was dead, she remembers her ex-husband, Brandon, pulling her into the garage with Lori's brother, Adam, on the phone on speaker to tell her Charles was dead. Adam was the one that told her. She said she went over to Lori's, and Lori and Tylee were still shook up. Then the explanation of the fight between Alex and Charles came up, and that Alex shot him. Alex told her personally that Charles had become enraged and they got into a physical fight. There was a baseball bat involved, and Charles hit Alex in the back of the head. And in return, Alex shot Charles. Lori told everyone different things about where she was moving, saying that she had to protect the kids and she was going into hiding. Melaniece visited them in Rexburg at the end of September. She said she wasn't with her kids, and she stayed in Lori's apartment with her. Of course, she didn't see the kids, and Melanie Gibb and David Warwick were not there. She did ask Lori about JJ and Tylee and said she got a few different answers. She said Tylee was with a friend from college, and JJ was with a nanny that Lori said she hired in the area who helped a lot with JJ. She never heard Tylee or JJ on the phone while Lori was in Idaho before Melaniece visited. And she doesn't remember if she saw Chad on that visit. They talk about her going to Missouri with Lori. Lori told Melaniece the nanny was helping with JJ and Tylee didn't need a babysitter. She said maybe Tylee was helping with JJ, but she can't remember. They talk about that trip she took with Lori to Hawaii in the middle of October 2019 in the time frame Tammy Daybell was killed. She said when Lori would talk on the phone, she would use headphones, so a lot of times she didn't know who she was talking to. She said she thought she knew the relationship between Lori and Chad, but now she knows differently. She said they were close, and Lori would say she talked or texted Chad, and then she would relay things to Melaniece that Chad said. While they were in Hawaii, Tammy dies. She said Audrey, who was with them, there's an objection that's sustained. She said Lori's demeanor was she was in a state of shock and surprised when she heard about Tammy's death. Then she went back to Idaho. Melaniece stayed in Hawaii longer. She found out later Alex was supposed to come with them to Hawaii, but Lori said Chad had something he needed Alex's help with. I really still feel Melaniece is protecting Lori, to be honest with you guys. It's just the vibe I got with her testimony. They move on to talk about the Church of the Firstborn. Lori and Chad said he believed he was going to help organize and learn more about the Church of the Firstborn. Their mission was to help with the second coming of Jesus. She turned to Chad for advice on who was light or dark. The word for people who were possessed were deemed zombies, and Lori was the one that told her that. Chad and Lori said if someone was possessed or a zombie, there's a type of darkness you couldn't cast out, and the person would pass away because the darkness was too much. The idea of that, according to Melaniece, originated from Chad. She talked to Lori and Chad about law enforcement, and they told her law enforcement was corrupt, couldn't be trusted, and they were after them. They told Melaniece not to talk to law enforcement. There were law enforcement officers that were deemed dark. One of those, Detective Ray Hermosillo and Detective Hope. Remember, Detective Hope is the father-in-law to Heather Daybell's daughter. In November of 2019, Melaniece was living in Rexburg at this time, and she also was in Rexburg in December of 2019. She learned JJ and Tylee were considered missing. Chad told her Madison County wasn't safe and she should move out of the county for the time being. She's asked about Lori and Alex's relationship. She said it was playful and fun, just a sibling relationship, and they would help each other out. She essentially said that Alex would do what Lori asked. She said Alex looked to Chad like a brother, and Alex had enough trust in Chad that he would do what Chad asked. Chad needed his help, and that's why Alex didn't go to Hawaii. When law enforcement was looking for the kids, Alex seemed calm and normal. They move on to talk about tracking devices. Chad told Melaniece that Brandon was following her and put a tracking device on her car. That was found when her car was being fixed. So in return, that validated a lot of the things Chad was saying to her. On Cross, Pryor talks about the trip to Hawaii. She doesn't know the exact dates, but it's the middle or end of October. They were there for a week or up to 10 days, maybe. He asked if Lori left for a longer trip to Hawaii in 2019 or 2020. She says after December, her and Chad left to stay in Hawaii. Pryor's asking about that length of time Lori disappeared, but Melaniece doesn't know. November of 2018, before all this started, she was living in Gilbert, Arizona, and lived about 10 minutes away from Lori, whose house was in Chandler. In November of 2018, she went to one preparing a people conference, and she's asked if she knew Melanie Gibb. She can't remember if Gibb was at that conference, but Chad was, and he was a speaker there. She thinks Lori had met Chad by November of 2018, and Melaniece at that point had met Melanie Gibb by then. That conference was in Mesa, Arizona, not far from where Melaniece lived. Pryor asked if the preparing of people gatherings are based on LDS faith. There's an objection that's sustained, but she said some were. The second coming is LDS based. He asked if the teachings at these conferences were inconsistent with LDS teachings, and she doesn't think so. He asked about the 7 gatherers, and she said it doesn't ring a bell. He asked, you don't recall being part of the 7 gatherers with Gibb, Zulema, Lori, and yourself? She doesn't remember. Pryor says the vast majority of your information you received about Chad came from Lori. She said most everything came through Lori. Pryor says you took her word for it, and she said yes. He says when Lori talked about moving from Arizona to Idaho, she wasn't clear where she was going to move or asked if there was a discussion after Charles's death Where Lori talked about living with Melanie Gibb, Melanie said that did not sound familiar at all. He moves on to light and dark and asked if LDS scripture mentions this. She said the basis came from the scriptures. He asked if she ever spoke face to face about the kids. She doesn't know if she did, and most of the information about the kids came from Lori. He asked about Julie Rowe and what does she do for a living. Melanie says she does podcasts, but she didn't attend any of these gatherings with Julie Rowe, and she was never a guest on Melanie Gibb's podcast. He asked if casting out is part of the LDS faith, and she said it's in there somewhat, but she's not familiar with what it says. He asked about energy work. She said some people believe in energy work. She's not familiar with it. It's almost like a reading, and they will say if you have certain cords attached to you or connections to your ancestors, it comes in that way. He asked, what about vibrations? And she said, in energy work, you can be on a higher or lower vibration frequency. He asked if it can be used to communicate with other entities as well as the dead. And she says, yes. She doesn't know a lot about energy work. She said Melanie Gibb was more familiar and she would listen when they talked, but still doesn't know a whole lot about it. She also doesn't remember talking to Gibb about energy work. Pryor points out Gibb was the one teaching about energy work, and she just doesn't remember who all was doing that. Pryor asked if she went to camps and talked about energy work, meaning Melanie Gibb. Yes. He points out zombie was a term she heard from Lori, and she assumed Chad used the term with Lori. Pryor asked if Chad used the word zombie in front of her, and she doesn't remember. Lori told you Alex had to help Chad with something. You didn't hear that from Chad? And she says no. Pryor asked if there's anything unusual with Alex and Lori's personal relationship. No. Pryor points out that Alex followed Lori when she moved. Did Alex live with Lori in Arizona? She said for a time, yes. She's asked if he wanted to move to Hawaii with Lori. She didn't know. He points out Alex did move with Lori to Idaho. On a redirect, Blake asked if Chad and Lori taught her those things, and she said they were both present and the ideas were from both of them. They talk about casting being part of the scriptures. Does the scripture refer to light and dark the way Chad and Lori would? And Melanie said they would elaborate on the basis of what, I guess, LDS scripture says about it. They had a way to explain where their ideas came from, and there was a spiritual basis for it, which she said made her listen to them. She's asked if Lori and Alex had separate apartments in Arizona. There's a sidebar by Pryor. When they get back, Lori and Alex had separate places in Arizona. She doesn't know if Alex went to Hawaii in 2019 at all. When you talk about Alex going to Hawaii in October, that was just for a trip, and Melanie said yes. She just planned that trip with Lori. Lori told her Alex said he was going to go, but the plans changed. As far as light and dark, she would ask Lori to get the answer from Chad whether or not somebody was dark. Miss Blake says Charles was designated as dark. Is he still alive? No. Was JJ designated as dark? Yes. Is he still alive? No. Was Tylee labeled as dark? Yes. Is she still alive? No. She is still under subpoena for today. And up was her husband next, Ian Pawlowski. Of course, he knows Lori, Alex, and Chad through Melaniece. He met Chad and Lori in person November 23rd or 24th of 2019 at Lori's townhouse. He met Alex the night he and Melaniece got married in Vegas. He had a Zoom call while he was at his sister's house to ask Chad and Lori for their blessing in asking Melaniece to marry him due to what he knew about their relationship. Melaniece saw Chad and Lori as parents. They gave their blessing and gave Ian a religious blessing. He said it's unorthodox to him with his own LDS beliefs. They were shielding him with light, removing dark weapons from him. He says usually a blessing is in person with a laying of hands, and he said to Melaniece it was very odd for him. Chad and Lori never mentioned Tylee and JJ, but their wedding night, Melanie shared some of the beliefs she had been taught. He was open to what he had heard before the wedding, but the weight and implications of what she shared their wedding night, she was scared Tylee and JJ were in danger, and she was worried about Chad and Lori's behavior. He talks about the next morning, his daughter thought it would be funny to play hide and seek in their hotel. He said it was quiet. Finally, he heard giggling. She was behind the curtain, but that scared him. He had concerns for JJ and Tylee, his ex-wife, and their 2 kids. He went to law enforcement December 4th or 5th with his concerns and sat down for an interview. He agreed to wear a wire for law enforcement. Chad and Lori talked about law enforcement being dark and possessed. They list off several detectives. He recorded a call the weekend they went on their honeymoon, meaning Melaniece and Ian, December 6th through the 8th. While the calls were being made, Ian knew JJ and Tylee were missing. They were living at an apartment just across from Melaniece, but they moved to her apartment after they got married. Chad told him they should leave as soon as possible to get away from law enforcement. Ian points out she looked to Chad and Lori as parent figures, and she was susceptible to being deceived. They bring in audio that was recorded by Ian. It's 87 minutes, but they only published certain parts. It was very hard to hear. I'm going to do my best. I'll go back and make sure I didn't miss anything. The first man you hear on this call is Alex Cox. The female is Zulema. Alex talks about David Warwick's not buying into their beliefs. Ian says Gibb and David were trying to step away because things were getting heated up. Alex said Gibb is going to the police and say she never had JJ at all. Remember, she told police she did have JJ, but gave him back to Lori. It took her a few weeks to admit she did not have JJ. You hear Zulema reference Raphael, who is Chad. And then Chad and Lori join in on the call, and Melanie starts crying, saying she misses them. Chad and Lori are referenced as mommy and daddy. So weird. She was relieved to hear their voices. Ian said that Chad and Lori would call, and then they would disappear for days or sometimes a week at a time. There were mentions about spiritual attacks from Satan. Melanie said she missed her kids the day before and was miserable. She said she was bawling in the temple. Ian says this goes back to the blessing they gave them. Melanie says Lieutenant Ball was bringing her banana bread when she was interviewing and water, and she thought he was trying to poison her. Lori says Lieutenant Ball is one of the good ones, is Detective Hope and Detective Hermosillo, who are the two bad ones. Lori says Gibb threw them all under the bus, and Lori says she's lost her place in the group. She has knowledge and may be held accountable for it. What knowledge, Lori? Are we admitting something bad Melanie Gibb knows? Lori says that Gibb may go to the police to admit she lied about having JJ when that welfare check took place. She said it's bad for Gibb to call and tell the police you're a liar. You're shooting yourself in the foot. But Lori says she didn't see that going anywhere for any of them. Melanie said, Julie said you guys said we should consider going to Idaho Falls, and we prayed about it. Either one will be fine. She said, I don't know if there's a better option. We feel we're okay to stay at our home. She said it's protected. Chad said he's worried law enforcement was still watching Melaniece, and she says they're probably tracking my phone. We're just hanging out at my apartment. Lori said she found a house that was cute, and she says, if you think we need to move, we thought we were fine. I mean, what can they do? Ian doesn't think she had spoken to law enforcement at this point, and Ian knew they were also looking for JJ and Tylee. Lori says, what can they do? Melanie says he's not going to stop. Chad says you need to get out of that. They're not going to leave you alone. They have a deep network, and you'll be seen as the target. And for her sake, she should leave. He says she was led to Rexburg to find Ian, but it's time for her to move. She said Ian's kids are there. And Chad says Madison County is cursed. Melaniece mentions getting an Airbnb. He says, no, you need to move for good. Melaniece asked how to get Detective Hermosillo to stop. She said he's just raged with this whole thing. He was yelling at me and said he's not going to stop. Chad says Detective Hermosillo isn't going anywhere and she needs to leave. But Melanie says, isn't Rexburg a safe place? Chad says something about a plague sweeping through and there will be people starving right next to a McDonald's. Lori says they were told to go to Rexburg, but the Agency of the Dark has infiltrated law enforcement. She says Lucifer can negotiate terms about eternal law, and they had no idea the police in Rexburg were infiltrated. Lori says because of the situation, you need to get out for a season, get out of their line of sight for your own sanity, and let Ian continue to go to work. Melanie says it's eerie when Ian isn't there. Chad said he hates to say it, but she needs to get out of the city. Tells her she can get a place in Idaho Falls for about the same price. Lori tells Melanie she did great. Melanie tells Lori some of the questions she was asked, including who did you go to Arizona with? And she said she drove with Ian. That's where we left off for lunch. I'm going to hurry up and try to get this episode out and be ready when lunch resumes. Ian Pawlowski still on the stand. I'll bring you the rest of it later tonight. We'll see you soon.